John Lamb Lash, I wish I had had more time to spend with your material, so you're going to have to bear with me on some of these questions. I only had a chance to sort of knock out the first couple of chapters, and then after that, I just have to put it on my nightstand until I get caught up with this later on.
Certainly. No problem.
It might mean that like about 3 weeks from now, you get more calls from me going, okay, what you said here in Chapter 11? I pride myself on being well-versed with the material, and especially with this, because it's just so interesting to me. And I love the way in which you get started in the story by talking about both the past, the conflicts of of how people talk about Gnosticism, which you believe is pretty much filtered through kind of a traditional Christian lens. So let's go back to the beginning. Tell us about what your original material was for your research for this book.
Well, I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard the word Gnostic, and they may have heard also the word Nag Hammadi, which is a place in Egypt where certain Gnostic texts were found in 1945. And all the scholars working today are basically drawing upon that body of material, those manuscripts that were found and actually had been hidden in the desert for about 1,600 years.
Right.
So you make a very important point regarding my work, and I'm glad you bring that up at the beginning, because I believe that I'm distinguished from all the other scholars who are writing on the Gnostic materials in the respect that I am not treating them from a Christian or a Judeo-Christian viewpoint. I am considering them as a pagan. I'm looking at the non-Christian and the pagan elements in those Gnostic materials.
So, and explain how you use the word pagan, because there are many flavors of paganism today.
Right. Pagan is a word that I use with some reticence and maybe some fear and trembling even at moments, because it is so easily taken wrongly. And it's a word that I would like to see corrected, because if we could have a corrected and a true and authentic definition of paganism, I think that it would help us to understand our past, and certainly would help us to understand the past of the European peoples. And, of course, we are all, in one way or another, mostly descendants of those European peoples who came over here. By pagan, in the way that I use it, I simply mean the native or indigenous peoples of Europe. And they were like native, we know the term Native Americans. Well, I use the term in my book, Native Europeans. There were tribes and cultures of Europeans who lived in the various parts of Europe, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, before the Christian era, that is over 2,000 years ago. And those were the pagan people. That is to say that they were nature people who had a religion related to nature, and they lived in a different cultural setting than later arose with Christianity.
All right, and so how do we differentiate? We talk about paganism today, and there are lots of different sort of brands of paganism. And
right, there are some new revivals of paganism and so forth, right. Yeah.
Okay, well, and how do we differentiate that between understanding the pre-Christian, maybe even pre-Judeo-Christian, although that's a little harder, but even simultaneous to the Jewish tradition, the development of those followers of the mystery cults?
Right.
Do we dare call those people pagans? I wouldn't think that would be fair.
No, the followers of the mystery cults and the founders of the mysteries were pagans. The best way to translate paganism, I believe, into our modern mindset is to just use the word animism. Pagan cultures were cultures that were based on animistic religion. And animistic religion means that they saw that nature was alive, that the earth was alive, and the religious and spiritual life of the pagans consisted in relating to that living presence of nature. You could say in a very, true sense, and perhaps this is helpful, that the Native American Indians who lived in America and Mexico before the colonialists arrived were pagans.
Right, and by this definition, I see how you would include that. So now, let me ask you how you would define, for the purposes of this discussion, although this will come up later on, how do you define extraterrestrials?
Well, I define extraterrestrials as a species that may exist in the cosmos or may inhabit the solar system that are not native to the planet Earth. That is not their native habitat. We, along with whales, bumblebees, and worms, and dogs and cats and tigers, are native to the Earth habitat. We live in the habitat. We're adapted to it. I would define extraterrestrials, which, as you know, are also discussed in these Gnostic materials, as a species that is not native and is an alien to this habitat.
Okay, and the point here I was trying to make is that they are, however, they are not divine in the sense that you're not talking about them as like angelic visitors or supernatural or otherworldly, other than the fact that they came from another world.
Well, according to the Gnostic teachings, they come from our solar system. They come from other parts of the solar system where we can't live, right. Other planets. But they are not divine. No, they at least not in the Gnostic teachings.
Right. That's what I just wanted to understand up front. Now, you said there, as you know, in the Nag Hammadi text, and I will say, I've read the Nag Hammadi stuff off and on over the last couple of years, probably 10 or 15 years or so of dipping into it, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls texts. Very interested in both of them. And so it would be wrong for me to say, yes, as I know that they're in there. I've never thought that they were in there. I think that there are a lot of scholars who would say, I don't see this thing about ETs or UFOs in the Nag Hammadi or the Dead Sea Scroll texts. So tell me, how do you start to get there? Where you begin your research with the, are there people mistranslating it? Are they not understanding what's actually there? Are you looking between the lines? What do you see that others are missing?
This is such a good question, and it's so important to clarify this, not only to understand my book, but to even get into the subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls and so forth. I want to make one thing clear at the beginning. I am not reading between the lines, and I am not inventing or projecting this interpretation. The reason why the public so far hasn't heard that flying saucers are described vividly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the reason why the public haven't heard that encounters with extraterrestrials, abduction experiences, are vividly described in the Gnostic materials is very simple. It's not because they're not there and they're not easy to see. They're there and they are literally in the text. But the scholars who are dealing with these texts are religious scholars trained in the universities, and it's kind of a blind spot. It's both a blind spot for them. They don't see it because it's alien material, to coin a term. And in order for them to treat and address that material, they would have to step out of their disciplinary framework, which is very difficult for them to do. They're writers about religion and theology, and they're not writers about science fiction or the paranormal. And so they tend to overlook these elements in these documents. But I tell you, I'm not making these up. These elements are in the documents, and they're very easy to see.
Okay, and so this is in that you go back to the original texts, and these are mistranslated?
No, they're not mistranslated.
Okay.
No, they're not at all. It's just that they're in the translations that exist. I'm not a translator, by the way. Okay. I can't translate from ancient Hebrew or Coptic, but I can work my way through it. But it's not a question of translation. It's a question of the blindness of a mindset. Scholars do not want to deal with this material because it's weird and it's out of their realm. So they present the public with what they can handle in these ancient documents.
Okay, and for the time being, we'll put weird in quotes.
Okay.
Because maybe by the end of this conversation, it will appear normal.
It may well be so.
It just might appear normal. All right, so we'll tie this all together as we go along, and we'll get back to the idea about Gnosticism and paganism, and just kind of, we'll steer clear of that for the moment and ask you, do you believe that then that it's no coincidence, as some people have posited, that Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls are found roughly at the same time, post World War II, post the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and about the same time that the first bona fide, eyewitness account of a flying saucer is made?
Well, would you call it a coincidence? I don't know. If it is, it's one hell of a big coincidence. I've pointed out in my book that the summer of 1947, three things happened simultaneously. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, excuse me, and the Nag Hammadi text, which had been discovered 18 months before, had been sitting in a drawer, and nobody really realized their significance. The significance of them was realized, and at the same time we had the Roswell crash, or the alleged Roswell crash, and we had the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which started the great UFO phenomena. And that all happened in the summer of 1947. Now, call it a coincidence, I don't know, but the remarkable thing is that both of these texts refer to UFOs, and they describe UFOs and extraterrestrials of the gray and of the reptilian type.
And those are distinctions we'll get further into too during the course of the conversation. Let's go back to then the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of the two, that's the one that I've probably read almost all of in the terms of the translations that exist. I've read a lot of them, and I've read several books and interviewed several authors about what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls and what isn't in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of them are very adamant that they would totally disagree with your conclusions.
Sure.
But where do you start to see where along the timeline of the Dead Sea Scrolls do you start to see references to extraterrestrials and UFOs?
Well, there are references in a number of places. If you want to cite text, the most obvious text, I think, are called the Songs of the Sacrifice of the Sabbath. And in these this is a long set of texts that were found in Cave 4. And in these texts, they refer to these beings, celestial beings, called the Kedoshim, and the cult that was situated at the Dead Sea looked to these Kedoshim as beings in the sky that would come and rescue them at a certain point. The Dead Sea documents are the documents of a very small cult, a very small Jewish cult that was ultra-conservative and that was, in a sense, at war with the Roman Empire and wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire and establish a Jewish state in the Holy Land. And they expected that they would be assisted in their war against Rome by these beings. And if you go and read the passages, in certain passages in the Songs of the Sacrifice of the Sabbath, I have one right here. They don't use the word flying saucer, but they talk about the glorious chariots, the shining round chariots of the sky, and they describe the behavior of these chariots in a way that resembles, word for word, current sightings of UFOs.
And where other scholars would say, well, what they're making reference to are angels. They're holding out for the hope that these divine warrior angels are going to come down and assist them in their unlikely fight against the Roman Empire. That the small good will be assisted by the divine and overcome the larger evil.
Right. They believed in divine intervention. I have no argument with that scholarly interpretation, but that scholarly interpretation does not rule out the possibility that they conceived of these beings as physical extraterrestrials.
And the chariots is an interesting thing, too, isn't it? They make a reference to, it doesn't sound like they're describing chariots.
No, because they call them glorious wheels with the likeness of fire, the spirit of the Holy of Holies. And they describe how they behave, how they seem to hover, and how they jut off rapidly at an angle and make movements that ordinary human vehicles cannot make. And this is all very clear.
And the question I asked you, too, at the beginning included this part about the timeline, because I understand that this is what I know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they are written over, in this intertestamental period. They're written over several hundred years.
That's right.
And the earliest scrolls differ significantly from the latest, from what the scholars believe were the last scrolls to be written, the ones with the least amount of history behind it before they're put into the jars.
Right.
Any idea where that particular reference is over the timeline? Was it early on that they established this, or did that come up later?
Yes, it was, because when the first earliest of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, which is about 160 B.C., the scribes that were writing them and the priests that were composing them off the Dead Sea outpost were drawing upon an apocalyptic tradition of certain Jewish prophets, like Ezekiel and Daniel. Right. And as you know, anyone who's read what I call biblical ufology, you probably know that there are many books that have been written about references to extraterrestrials and UFOs in the Bible. They always cite Ezekiel's vision.
Of the wheel.
Yeah, that's right. And they say, well, this was not a symbolic or metaphysical vision. This was an actual description of a UFO. So the authors who wrote these descriptions were drawing upon that tradition. And I tend to think that the older Dead Sea Scrolls, the ones that were written before 100 B.C., will reflect this evidence of UFO activity very strongly.
All right, and so that's one of the references in that particular books of, was it the Songs of Sacrifice?
Yeah, the Songs of the Sacrifice of the Sabbath. Okay. But there are many references to the Kedoshim, who are the heavenly angels, who are warrior angels, who always come in shining round chariots. Now, shining round chariots is as it is translated by scholars. Now, I'm certain if we had one of those scholars online and we said, well, could these shining round chariots be UFOs, they might dismiss that idea as ridiculous. But I don't believe that we can afford ourselves to do that, really.
Well, and have you ever run this by a rabbi?
No, I haven't.
It might be interesting just because there's a lot of times where idiomatic Hebrew,
right?
An expression like that, shining round chariot, might have a different ring to a Hebrew scholar like a rabbi. They may hear in that, much like we might say, a long dark limousine or something, and we conjure a mental image from that. I'd be curious to see what mental image comes up when they hear shiny round chariot. What in the Jewish tradition that might mean figuratively, if there's a figurative meaning. But let's go down that road some more. Then when we come back, then let's do the same thing that we just did there, discussing this from the template of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's do it the other way. Let's start in Nag Hammadi then with John Lamb Lash, the text which comes to Western culture, comes to the world within the same period of time really as the Dead Sea Scrolls do. And let's find out what they say then about shiny round chariots or some such. And then we'll get into the question of how did that inform the mystery cults? And what do the Gnostics know about UFOs that we don't know? And what this all has for paganism and the fight against Christianity in the earliest years. We'll get to it all. Not in His Images, the book. It's Coast to Coast Live. My name is Ian Punnett. John Lamb Lash. We just started setting the table on where we're going on this, so be patient, because the firmer the foundation, I think the faster we'll be able to go from here, and it's way cool. I mean, where John is starting is with these ancient Hebrews who were building this community and had in their belief system, and he says right there in the Dead Sea Scrolls you can see it, is the hope that extraterrestrials would come to their aid in their fight against the Romans. And you look at how they describe the chariots, it sounds a lot more like spaceships, and that hasn't even gotten yet to the mystery cults and how this all ties in together. Next on Coast to Coast Live, This is Ian Punnett. Just heard there in one of the spots that ran, Dr. Phil was in the commercial, and that just reminds me, too, that he's in the Treehouse of Horrors, the new Simpsons Halloween special that comes up in a couple of weeks. And I just happened to be watching it last night. I got an advanced DVD of the new Treehouse of Horrors coming up on Fox, the Simpsons annual Halloween special, and it's excellent. It's a really good one. And they're not all great, but this one's really good. Very profound ending, I might add. And I don't. I get them. I can't share them with you, and I can't tell you anything more than that, or I'd be in trouble. And they wouldn't send them to me anymore, which would be bad. And I have to be honest and say I don't get them, but a friend of mine gets them, and he lets me see them. I'm not anybody, but he's somebody. So I'm a friend of somebody important. I'm somebody once removed. But it's a really good Halloween episode coming up. So not in his image, John Lamb Lash. We're just getting started. So we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran.
Right.
And their belief system. Let's go to Nag Hammadi, because that's probably of the two the one that most people know less about. But that might even pertain more to the conversation that we have than the DSS.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a big difference between the sources of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the source of the Nag Hammadi materials. The Qumran community at the Dead Sea near Jerusalem was actually a very small splinter cult of Jewish religion. It was not a mainstream aspect of Jewish religion at all. You could compare it to a cult like the Branch Davidians or the Heaven's Gate cult of those people, remember, that
Sure.
killed themselves together?
Sure.
Yeah, in the sense that there was a great Jewish presence, in the Roman Empire and in the ancient world. About 10 to 15% of the people in the Roman Empire at the time of the first century were Jewish. And so it was a large part of the population. But this Dead Sea cult was a very, very small cult of about 10,000 members, and they did not represent the view of the Jewish people. In fact, they were feared by the Jewish people because of their radical and apocalyptic ideas and because of their militant attitude toward the Roman Empire. They brought a lot of grief upon the population of mainstream Jews.
Yeah, they're kind of separatists.
They were separatists. They were xenophobes.
Right.
They were against their own people in certain ways, in that they considered that some Jews or Hebrews of that time were not worthy of the covenant with God and would not be rescued by the Kedoshim. So the Dead Sea Scrolls really represent cultic material of a very bizarre kind. And the point that I'm making, which many scholars would disagree with, is that the evidence shows that they were actually a flying saucer contact cult.
Explain how, other than you've mentioned the the heavenly contact or the heavenly imagery of somebody coming down and saving them possibly from another planet. Other than that, what other evidence do you see of them being a UFO contactee cult?
Well, there are, I would say, several kinds of evidence. One evidence is the passages, such as we just discussed, in which they talk about round, shining chariots. And so I consider that to be textual evidence. The second evidence is that they were drawing upon the apocalyptic tradition of prophets whose writings, Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, whose writings also have been interpreted as contactee writings. And the third thing is the whole mindset of these people was oriented toward off-planet salvation. They had the mindset of a UFO cult. That's probably the most convincing evidence. And the evidence of that mindset is all through the documents in the Dead Sea material.
All right, so how do you see that paralleling Nag Hammadi?
Well, there's no parallel because, in fact, the documents that were found at Nag Hammadi are the product of an entirely different culture, of an entirely different group that was in an entirely different sacred tradition from the Dead Sea material. In fact, there's really no comparison between the Gnostics and the members of the Dead Sea cult. They were quite different in their spiritual outlook. They were quite different in their philosophy and in their practices.
I might throw a challenge to you on that.
Sure.
But let's go back and talk about what scholars believe, and maybe what you would agree with most scholars, as to who is responsible for burying these texts, these Nag Hammadi texts. Why did they do it, and what do we know about the community that did it?
Well, as to the first two questions, I can say no one knows who exactly did it or even why they did it. No one really knows. And, I've read hundreds of books on the Nag Hammadi materials, and I've talked to scholars in Europe and America, and none of them has an explanation of that. So that is a complete unknown.
Go ahead, please, then.
As to the question of the most that we can do and ask about this material is, well, what context did it come from, What tradition did it grow out of? And my view is that the Nag Hammadi Gnostic materials were written by the people who maintained the mystery schools. They were pagan teachers, pagan mystics and seers who belonged to a long tradition that was preserved in the mysteries. And the Nag Hammadi materials are their product, or a second or third hand version of their teachings.
See, and I would think that most scholars would agree with that they would say that these are part of the Gnostic blend of Christianity that was popular. The farther you get away from the center of the faith, the more likely there was to be a blend of these traditions where people sort of existed without fear of somebody coming down and insisting on an orthodoxy. But as the church became centralized and therefore more powerful through the structure of the empire, those Gnostic Christian cults became more and more threatened and felt like the only thing they could do is to sort of, it's like ditch the gun after the scene of a crime or something. They thought we got to put this material someplace so that we won't get caught with it. What do you think about that?
Well, that's possible. It is a fact that, and all scholars agree, that when the Christian converts and the ideologues defined their religion and they defined their doctrines, that they repressed and suppressed all competing doctrines. So in that sense, they drove the Gnostic people, the Gnostic teachings, underground, and they, to a very great extent, destroyed them. They destroyed their temples, they destroyed their libraries, and in some cases, they murdered them. My book begins with the story of one of those murders.
And so that's how I would draw a parallel between the Qumran community and the Nag Hammadi community. I would say they were both victims of attempting a more powerful religious or religious political organization. And in the case of Nag Hammadi, they somehow ran afoul and probably were either chased and or persecuted by the mainstream Christian church of the time, just as the Qumran community, tweaked a fight with Rome.
Right.
And it ended up getting squashed, and that's why all we have from them, from either of those, are just the writings that they hid before their demise.
Well, I can accept that parallel up to a certain extent, but there's something that we shouldn't overlook here, and that is the extent of which the Gnostic materials existed in the ancient world. Now, as far as I know, the materials that belong to the Dead Sea cult belonged exclusively to that cult, which I said was a splinter group. Right. And that they were very limited materials, and they were only found in the centers where that cult existed, their desert hideaways, as it were. On the other hand, the material that was comparable to the Gnostic material found in Egypt existed in many libraries all around the Mediterranean and the Near East, because the Gnostics wrote prolifically, and they had schools and libraries in Syria, Egypt, Palestine, Greece, and so there was an enormous amount and an enormous range of Gnostic writings that was destroyed and burned when Christianity came to power.
Well,
so in that sense, they're not parallel. But the parallel that you make is quite, I can follow that, sure.
All right, so then let's say that you say you see evidence of the community the apocalyptic community at Qumran to be kind of an isolated Jewish cultic group focused on a past UFO or perhaps even an ongoing UFO contact experience.
Exactly, an ongoing one, I would say. Yes.
Okay. Do we have any evidence of a UFO contacts in the Nag Hammadi text?
Yes, but it's a different kind,
right,
and the difference is remarkable.
Right.
Because whereas in the Dead Sea material, it is very clear, and no scholar's interpretation could change this, that the Dead Sea sect is looking for rescue and salvation from the beings in the shining round chariots.
Ooh.
Okay, so there's no question about that. When you look at the evidence of extraterrestrials in the Nag Hammadi material, they are viewed as intruders and as a deviant influence on humanity and not as saviors.
And so that might bring us to then who it was that were in the shiny round chariots.
Well, the cross-connection between these two ancient findings is very interesting because it seems to me, as far as I know, I'm the only scholar who's ventured this viewpoint up till now, that the Gnostics had investigated the phenomenon of the Tzaddikim. The Tzaddikim is the technical name, the Jewish name for that Dead Sea cult. It means the righteous ones.
Right.
And it seems to me that there is clear evidence, and I bring this out in my book, that the Gnostics were interested in the spiritual phenomena of this cult, and they investigated this cult, and they identified who these beings were, and to the Gnostics, these beings were not benevolent. So, in a sense, the Gnostics viewed the Tzaddikim as a cult that had fallen into the hands of a malevolent species, and believed that species was going to save them.
Okay, so the extraterrestrials in contact with the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran.
Mm-hmm.
We don't. Are you? Well, see, I'm kind of confused. Is it that you believe that they were a malevolent species of extraterrestrials, or only that the folks who were writing the mystery / Gnostic Christian material of Nag Hammadi viewed them as malevolent? Was it possible that they were a benevolent race of ETs, but that's just not how the Nag Hammadi people saw it?
Well, sure it is. But I'm one of the things I try to do as a scholar is I try to present to people today the most accurate translation I can of what the Gnostics thought. And the Gnostics, by the way, were not Christians at all. One of the things that has been terribly mishandled by Gnostic scholars, some of those who've written popular books, for instance, like Elaine Pagels, is
right.
that they have not allowed the public to understand that more than half of the material in the Nag Hammadi text is non-Christian and even could be called anti-Christian. And so it's really incorrect to mix the words Gnostic and Christians, because in the purest sense, Gnostics were not Christians and they were opposed to Christianity in very specific ways. So to answer your question, and it's very important to be clear on this question,
okay.
The way that the Gnostics saw the extraterrestrials of the Dead Sea was that they viewed them as malevolent. That's how they viewed them. And you're asking me, or I believe that. Well, I find that their view and their analysis of these beings and the origin of these beings and how they behave and what their influence on humanity is, I find it to be very convincing. So I'm inclined to think that they were probably right in regarding those beings that way, and that the Dead Sea sect people were probably caught up in a psychotic delusion.
Okay, meaning what? That they thought that these extraterrestrials were going to come to their aid in the fight against the Romans, and they were deluding themselves that it was going to happen?
Well, they did think that, and obviously that didn't happen because they were destroyed by the Romans, and no one came to save them from the sky or anywhere else.
So could that be, though, that they're just psychotic and they were deluding themselves that there were extraterrestrials?
That's possible, but according to the Gnostic view, again, according to the the Gnostic, I call them seers, initiates, whatever you'd like to call them, that this phenomenon was real. They believe that it was a real phenomenon. They believe that there are real entities from outer space that had seized upon this cult and captured the minds of the people in this cult. They didn't dismiss it as a mere delusion, but what was delusional was the way that the Dead Sea sect regarded and evaluated these entities.
Why do you believe ultimately then that the Qumran community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, why do you believe they were abandoned? Why did they end up in this David and Goliath-like fight with the Romans?
Well, the comparison, I would make it again because I think it helps people today understand we were all gripped here in America by the David Koresh phenomena, by what happened at Waco.
Okay.
We understand what a radical, xenophobic, apocalyptic religious sect is because we've seen the evidence of it in our time. We had the Jim Jones thing long ago.
Right.
We had the Heaven's Gate. And the comparison of that to the Zedekim of the Dead Sea is very helpful because that is exactly who they were. And they were destroyed, of course, by the Romans, but ultimately they were destroyed by their own belief system.
Well, sure, but if to compare that to, say, David Koresh thought that there would be, mighty unseen forces coming to his aid, and then they didn't. So do we think, though, that it was a setup, that there were these ETs that were prodding the Qumran community to take on the Romans, and then they pulled the fast, or they pulled the rug out from under them and left them there fighting all alone? Or were they just wrong in their estimation that somebody was going to come and help them?
Well, again, I follow the interpretation based on the Gnostic materials that which I would paraphrase in this way: the Dead Sea sect people had UFO contact, they had ET contact, and they mistook it. They invested a belief in it that was incorrect in regard to the true nature and intent of those extraterrestrials.
Hang on to that thought. We'll get back to more on this with John Lash, and we'll talk about the difference between the Greys and the Reptilians as he sees it in these ancient texts and in the mystery cults next on Coast to Coast Live.